Assassin's Creed is a franchise that takes you back in time through genetic memory, as they will call it, to relive the lives of a certain ancestor. In every game, we visit a time period notable in our history as we meet historical figures, locations, and events. And since you clicked on this video, you're probably wondering how much you can rely on the games for your history education, more so than your own history class. Fear not, as I, the serial plagiarist, will take you to the Holy Land during the Third Crusade and discussing the accuracy of what is presented, going back to the original. If this is to become a series, I will probably stop at Origins, because future games have given the player RPG choices, or at least the illusion of choice, and have made it unclear of what happened in the Assassin's Creed lore. So I'll just stop there. Also, this video is heavily inspired by the now inactive channel Online Knights, who made a similar video about the accuracy of Assassin's Creed before they became Offline Knights and were never seen again. I swear that my video will discuss the history in my own words. I know I'm a serial plagiarist, but trust me, I am simply inspired by their video. Alright? Good. Also, one last thing. Since we're talking about history, it's important to note that events like the Crusades also rely on our moral and religious views. Since I'm not religious, I'll just discuss the histories I see fit. I get to be the teacher. Let's just start the video. Assassin's Creed 1 is set during the Holy Land in the Third Crusade. Since it's called the Third Crusade, I'm going to have to talk about the history leading up to that. So let me sum it up. Christianity and Islam had been at odds since forever. At the time of the First Crusade, Europe was an insanely violent place, with kingdoms fighting each other, but what we want to focus on is the Byzantine Empire. In 1095, the Seljuk Turks, followers of Islam, invaded Asia Minor and conquering Byzantine lands. Since the Byzantines were Christian, the Byzantine Emperor asked for help from the Pope, Urban II. Urban took the opportunity to unite the violent Europe by declaring a holy war on the invading Turks. So the Christian kingdoms united under a common enemy, and knights who wanted to redeem themselves with their sins bore the cross and went off to war. The First Crusade was a success, taking back the land lost and setting up Christian kingdoms. The sequel, the Second Crusade, happened when the Turks came back decades later and conquered Edessa. The Second Crusade was critically panned by the Christian world because it was a failure and achieved very little. That leads us to 1187, where the Third Crusade happened when Salah ad-Din, founder of the Ubisoft Empire, probably butchered that name, and leader of the Muslim armies during the Third Crusade, captured Jerusalem, modern-day capital of Israel. So as you would guess, all the Christian kingdoms teamed up to get the Muslims out. Three kingdoms, England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, led by the respective king/emperor of those kingdoms, began to lead troops into battle. An interesting fact to note was that both France and England were at war, but put that aside to fight their common religious enemy. To sum up the events leading up to the time frame of the game, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa started their conquest, but then he fell off his horse while crossing the Salif River and drowned. With that being said, England arrived in the Holy Land in August 1191, and France joined in on the fun a few weeks later. The English army conquered Cyprus and then joined the Siege of Acre, a battle to take back the city for the Christian world in June 1191. They were able to take the city in mid-July, but don't celebrate just yet, guys. The English king, Richard the Lionheart, had a disagreement on who was supposed to take over as king of Jerusalem when they got around to conquering it. It was agreed that a dude named Guy would take over as king of Jerusalem, but immediately upon death, Conrad of Montferrat and his family would take the crown. If that name sounds familiar, it's because his historical father, William of Montferrat, is a target in the game. Anyways, French King Philip Augustus decided to go back to France and call it a day. Richard was upset at this, but Philippe did leave most of his army and the money that was supposed to pay them to Richard. Now, I've summed up a lot of events and skipped over a lot of stuff, but we'd be here all day if I went into the full history of the Crusades in detail. So for the rest of the video, I want to show the player the game and discuss how accurate it was. The game starts with our protagonist, Altair ibn Lahad, sent on a mission with 3 other guys by his master Al-Mualim to Solomon's temple in Jerusalem to recover a treasure. He kills an innocent man, and we get a taste of Altair's personality. He is obnoxiously arrogant, as Malik and his younger brother Kadar try to warn him not to be so headstrong. Of course, Altair doesn't listen, and this becomes problematic when they get to the treasure, only to see that Robert de Saab has come for the same thing. Now, this might surprise many of you, but Robert de Saab actually existed in history. Robert de Saab was born in France under a respected military family. During the Third Crusade, he was one of Richard the Lionheart's commanders. Since there is no painting, therefore no idea what Robert looked like, of course the game makers made his appearance up. What can be said is Robert is depicted to be younger than his historical counterpart. Granted, Robert de Saab is thought to be early to mid-40s around this time, so I guess it's not too absurd that it looks like he's in his early 30s. Anyways, Robert de Saab deflects Altair's attacks, and Altair is forced to go back to Masyaf empty-handed. Masyaf, located in modern-day Syria, was home to an organization known as the Hashasins, which is basically the stand-in for the Assassin's Creed. Let's talk about the Hashasins for a bit. The Hashasins were founded in 1090. They were pretty much a group of hitmen who actually helped invent the term assassin, given their methods. It's said that the assassins of the faction worked to eliminate both Islamic and Christians alike, depending on who crossed them. Assassins were blindly loyal to the Grand Master through drug manipulation, as in they would be drugged, shown a nice place with the Grand Master saying that it was paradise, and that they had to do what he said if they wanted to go there in the afterlife or whatnot. The assassins worked in infiltration and used weapons like knives and daggers to execute their kills. However, these assassination jobs were usually one-way missions, as none of the assassins were expected to return. They were just supposed to kill the target and then die. I mean, if they could get away, great, but it was usually a death sentence. So already that's a huge deviation from the game. In this first level, it's a retrieval mission, so it makes sense, but future missions of course don't make sense. So with that being said, Altair returns to Masyaf, expressing failure to his master Al-Mualim, who scolds him, especially when Malik returns without his brother, with the artifact, doing what Altair could not. Now, Al-Mualim is the game's alias to a man known as Rashid ad-Din Sinan. However, in the game, Al-Mualim also has his inspiration from the original leader of the Hashasins, Hassani Sabah, which is something we'll see in a bit. The Templars attack Masyaf, which is completely fictional. Speaking of which, the Templar Order is also based on a real organization. The Knights Templar were founded around 1119. They were a Catholic military order that was at its strongest during the Crusades. Of course, historically, Robert de Saab would have been the Grand Master of the order, and aside from their armor, they are pretty much fictionalized. This siege of Masyaf in the game never happened. In fact, when it comes to historical interactions between the Hashasins and the Knights Templar is quite minimal. They did interact some of the time, and from what I can tell, they weren't nice interactions, but otherwise, the two organizations barely interacted with each other. So in this fictional siege, Altair and 2 others are ordered by Al-Mualim to jump off to their deaths, which is actually just a ruse to catch the Templars off guard. This is inspired by a story where Hassani Sabah also ordered his men to jump off to their deaths to intimidate Seljuk Turks, although that same attempt said that those guys actually did jump to their deaths. Anyways, with the Templars driven out of Masyaf, Altair is scorned for his poor handling of his mission, and then stabbed. Dan wakes up being offered a second chance. He is sent to kill 9 men that corrupts the Holy Land, continue the war and bloodshed, and ultimately need to be killed to bring peace. Assassin's Creed has been criticized for being repetitive with its mission structure, and it's certainly a problem here. Basically, the formula goes like this. Go to a city, talk to the bureau leader, gather intel, go back to the bureau leader, see a cutscene that gives us a poor first impression of our target and why they must die, and we do just that. A missed opportunity in future games is making you question these Templars' morality. Every Templar Altair kills stands by their life decisions and try to justify themselves rather than spouting typical bad guy dialogue. It's interesting because you start to think that maybe these Templars mean well, but they do bad things to achieve their goals, in a sort of do the ends justify the means sort of way. The only other games to really do this was Assassin's Creed 3 and Rogue. Some of their targets are fictional, some are inspired by real people, and some are real people. For the sake of this historical comparison, we'll simply do the latter two as they appear in the game. First, Garnier de Nablus was the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitalier from 1190 until his death in 1192. The game is very inaccurate when it comes to this guy. First, he was mid-40s when he died, but the game depicts him as being in his 60s at youngest. Also, accounts at the time show that his portrayal is character assassination. Garnier was a far better person than what the game presents to the player, and there is no evidence that Garnier did unethical things to his prisoners. Also, in this game, he's assassinated in 1191, whereas he actually died a year later. So the game is way off from his depiction. Next, we've got William of Montferrat, who was basically the liege lord of Acre in the game. This role he had is entirely fictional. I could not find anything that gives him this role. Also, like Garnier, his age is way off. William is depicted as a man who is probably in his mid-40s, where in real history he probably would have been early 80s. Also, he did die in 1191, but not because of assassination. Also, the game blames him for a massacre of Sassaran prisoners, when really it was King Richard who ordered the massacre, which is strange when you see him scold William for it in the game. A thing to note is that his fictional assassination in the game is inspired by the assassination of William's historic son, Conrad of Montferrat. Conrad, as mentioned earlier, was to be king of Jerusalem, but he was assassinated days before he was crowned. It was the Hashasins under the orders of Rashid ad-Din Sinan. However, it is argued to this day who got Rashid to assassinate Conrad, or if Rashid was acting on his own accord. Next, we've got Majd ad-Din, who may or may not be inspired by two historical figures. The first is Bahar ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who was the one who wrote the biography on Salah ad-Din. The second is Salah ad-Din's brother, whose name I'm not even gonna try to pronounce. However, since it's unclear, I'll just skip it. There's also Jubayr al-Hakam, inspired by one Ibn Jubayr, a scholar at the time. Then there's Meister Sabrand, who has very little information about him, other than being the first Grand Master of the Knights Teutonic. Lastly, we've got Robert de Sab after his absence for most of the game. We find out that Robert is in Jerusalem, which turns out to be a trick as it turns out to be a woman named Maria, who in the Assassin's Creed lore becomes Altair's future wife. She reveals that after the many defeats of the Templars, Robert came up with the idea to turn the Crusaders and the Saracens against the Assassin's Creed since they've killed men important to both sides. Altair rides to Arsuf to confront Robert de Sab, and Richard says that whoever wins is the one God favors, which is a really bad idea, but I guess it's how people rolled back then. Anyways, Robert de Sab is killed, which is inaccurate because he actually died in 1193 from natural causes. And as you guessed it, this Crusader-Sassaran alliance thing is completely fictional. So Altair encourages Richard to make peace with Salah ad-Din, which is an Assassin's Creed trope, pull a Forrest Gump, and influence big things behind the scenes. Anyways, Altair returns to Masyaf after learning from Robert that Al-Mualim actually worked with the Templars to get the Peace of Eden, then betrayed them because he didn't want to share it. It turns out the artifact he was sent to retrieve is a mind-controlling device, so a final boss fight with Al-Mualim happens and he is killed. This is all, as you probably guessed, entirely fictional, although it is loosely inspired about a story about Hassani Sabah, the original leader of the Order, where one of his assassins returned to him after a botched assassination attempt. During this confrontation, Sabah supposedly said, "Nothing is an absolute reality, all is permitted," which we all know what that inspired. So the game ends with Altair possessing this piece of Eden. The end. Of course, the game in both historical and modern day periods always end in cliffhangers, and this game is no exception. I hate how every game in the franchise ends in a cliffhanger. This game is very inaccurate when it comes to events. The period of the Third Crusade it decided to tackle is acceptable because it was a null in military activity between the two sides, but everything is straight up wrong. The Assassin-Templar conflict was fictional, the Siege of Masyaf was fictional, the assassinations Altair carried out were fictional, and the Crusader-Sassanid alliance was fictional too. This is the first game and we're already off to a bad start. The only praise I can really give is the atmosphere of the game, wherein both the Christian and Islamic cities preach about their efforts, but that's about it. Also, I should probably explain how the Third Crusade ended. To sum it all up, Richard the Lionheart made peace with Saladin, with the compromise that Christians could go to Sassanid conquered cities for pilgrimages if they wanted to. Years later, Pope Innocent III called for a crusade because he wanted to try again. This sequel was even worse than the Second Crusade. But I'm getting off track. That's the history of the Third Crusade against Assassin's Creed. On a historical accuracy ratio, I'm gonna give this a 2.5 out of 10. Hopefully the sequel can do better. I hope I haven't gotten too political or religious with this video. I simply want to present the history in my own way. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?